I wanted to go over this isms PowerPoint. Second period, we missed several isms, and then fourth period, you might want to review this and then work on the last ism, which is nationalism. So just really quick, I want to review the isms we already did. Empiricism is all about empirical thinking, and it's really the first ism that we're covering in here. And I just want to do a review before I start this. In terms of these isms, and where they fit into history, like the context. You're thinking about mostly in Europe, and you're thinking about a time period when we have new ways of thinking, new opportunities to actually sit down and think because you're not worried about survival anymore. And a lot of these ideas are going to stem from the Enlightenment. A lot of the ideas are going to come from revolutions. And we start to see a new way of thinking politically, economically, in terms of human rights. And so we're going to look at all of these. So the first one is empiricism. And it was really a way to think about knowledge as something that you yourself, you observe, you repeat behaviors, and from that you learn. And it's basically saying that the natural law of the world and things that happen should start being looked at a little bit more than just traditional things and religion. And so it spurs a lot of the Enlightenment ideas that are going to happen because the Enlightenment thinkers are going to look at society and start to think about what type of government would best rule that society. And it's cool because it's the first time in Europe for a long time, like since Rome, when the people really thought about, like, hey, here are my human qualities, and here's the best way to have a government to keep control, but to also protect those human abilities that I have. The next ism is also in terms of politics, and it's kind of a mixture of the Enlightenment ideas and then the old governments of the past. It's called enlightened absolutism, and you have rulers who look at this as an example. They see Louis XVI, who had been beheaded during the French Revolution, and they don't want that to happen. They still want to stay in power, but they're willing to bring ideas of the Enlightenment into their nation state. And so they typically create constitutional monarchies where they still have the power of a king or a queen, but they give people a constitution that gives them rights like life, liberty, and property. This happened in Russia under Catherine the Great. This happened in Prussia under a leader named Frederick. And then this had happened in England. So we see a lot of constitutional monarchies as an option that's an alternative between absolutism and then full on democracy. We also talked about deism. We had seen a shift of moving away from religion already. During the Renaissance, they started to question religion a little bit. During the scientific revolution, they really started to question the way that churches would teach people about scientific things that just weren't completely accurate. And then we saw the Reformation, where we saw some corruption within the church and people questioning that. Deism is such an enlightenment way to question religion. And so this is what we'll look at. We see a new relationship between humans and God, where we have an idea that divinity, God, religious figures, are going to create the world and set natural laws in motion, but then those natural laws are meant to just play themselves out, and human nature takes over. We also see that scientific inquiry starts to become more important to people in the Enlightenment than studying the Bible. So we talked about in one of our classes the plague. And you have the plague hitting Europe. And a lot of people blamed religion and thought maybe they had sinned and that's why the plague was happening. Then they started to look to the Bible to get answers. And that really didn't work for them. And so a lot of people start to think more logically and they say, okay, logically, and if I use reason, I need to think about the fact that germs and overpopulation is really one reason why the plague is going to spread. uh, I want to start focusing on economic philosophies. And the reason that these new economic philosophies are going to come into the scene is because the type of economy that we're looking at is so new. that people are trying to figure out the way that it's going to best work. It's new because really for the first time we have a global economy. We have systems in play where you have private companies now doing economic activities, not just the monarch. So the first economic philosophy is called capitalism. Capitalism is a philosophy where you have private interests, joint stock companies, specifically from the colonial age, private interests, private investments, entrepreneurship, people wanting to start businesses. And that becomes more important than the government trying to create the economy and then all the money going to the government. We see natural laws of supply and demand. And this fits in with Enlightenment thinking, because Enlightenment thinking is all about natural laws, and that happens with the economy too. There are natural continuing laws of supply and demand, and it's not always the same products. And then there's also, you should write down, natural laws of consumerism. Humans are always wanting to consume things. When you think of capitalism, a lot of the items that people were wanting to consume, they were luxury items. So whenever you could get a hold of a luxury item, you typically did better as an entrepreneur with a private investment. The head philosopher that really discusses capitalism is named Adam Smith with his book called The Wealth of Nations. He's the first one to coin the idea of capitalism, and then everybody else who works on that takes his ideas. There are two main concepts that he talks about for capitalism. The first one is laissez-faire. And laissez-faire basically means that the government should be hands-off when it comes to economics. You have consumers, and those consumers have a demand for products. And then private companies should work on supplying those demands. And the government should not get involved, because when the government gets involved, then you have restrictions to these natural laws of humans who are bartering and bargaining and everything like that. So laissez-faire means the government should be hands-off. And a lot of people also took this as a political philosophy. And some people said that human liberties and freedoms are so natural and important for the individual that governments should actually stay out of it. So these are people who think the government should stay out of politics. The other concept that he came up with is the invisible hand that I'll show you later on. So when you look at this, you're looking at three different ways that an economy can really be run. And this is a typo here. We'll talk about that. In the old system, where you have absolute monarchs, you see an autocratic type of economy where the one ruler, king or a queen, is telling you what to do, what to buy, how to be a consumer. We talked about how in England, Queen Elizabeth forced people to consume tobacco because it was a product from the colonies and it made England money. Then during the Enlightenment and with the Wealth of Nations, we see people moving more towards either laissez-faire or a democratic type of economy. Under laissez-faire, you look at your people and say, do this or that as you see fit. Do what works best for you. That's capitalism. If you want to start a business, great. You have the opportunity to do that, to be successful. You just have to meet the natural flow of supply and demand. If you just want to be a consumer, great. You can just be a consumer and you can fit in and create that supply and demand. So this is capitalism. Then you see more of like a democratic socialism, where it's leaders looking at the people and saying, what do you think we should do? What do you think we should sell? What do you think we should produce? What do we need to produce? And it's really looking more at the interests of the people than figuring out what needs to be produced there. In terms of the invisible hand, Adam Smith really promotes the idea of knowing what the people need and then allowing consumers to consume in the way that they want. He says that you should provide the best possible goods, but at the lowest possible price, and that you should be benefiting the consumers. The whole goal of the economy to him is to benefit the consumers. And then he looks specifically at what drives economics. And his main philosophy is that capitalism is all about having competition and having people who have these self-interests that make them act upon that and create businesses, or you have competition that just naturally regulates the free market. It's a free market system where anybody can sell something, but they're probably going to have to compete with somebody else who's selling the same thing, and then that benefits the consumer because you're not going to be able to charge people too much because a competitor will come in and charge less. And it creates this balance that protects the consumer, but also benefits them because they're getting these quality products. You see profit-seeking producers are going to make more, but you also see that the needs of the society are going to be met through these producers. Laissez-faire, the government should not get involved. Competition should keep quality high, and competition should keep prices low. So if you look at pizza companies, if you think of Domino's, Papa John's, and Pizza Hut, they have to keep a high quality to keep the consumer, but they also have to give deals. They have to try to give low prices so that they can get the most consumers and then eventually make more of a profit off of that and wedge out their competitors. So this is all how capitalism works. Later on, you're going to look at political socialism, and then I'm also going to talk about economic socialism and how it really counteracts capitalism. But first, I want to talk about political changes. A lot of the political changes happened after Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated and died. In Europe, Napoleon, and he's not really in your standards, and I don't know why. I would suggest watching a crash course on him to understand everything Napoleon did. Napoleon took over in France after their first revolution and republic failed. And he basically becomes an emperor who tries to take over Europe. He's defeated by Russia, he's defeated by Britain, he's exiled twice, and his second time he's going to pass away. When he is done trying to take over Europe, the rest of the European nations get a little freaked out that we might have a European nation again who's going to try to create an empire. So we see them meet at a city of Vienna, Austria. And at this meeting, there's a lot of conservative European thinkers who want to preserve traditional Europe. And so what they do is they get together and devise a plan to try to restore monarchs to power because they think that the Enlightenment ideas led to someone like Napoleon. And they try to create a powerful set of European nations that will share equal power in Europe without trying to take one another over. And you don't really need to know the results of the Congress of Vienna. If you want to look here, it does change some boundaries. So you can kind of see you have these different nation states, and what they try to do is they try to create solid boundaries, especially like in the German states here, to make sure that France is put into check. But what it does is it just sparks different political beliefs, and you start to see how intense they are in the debates. So there's two different political beliefs. On the left, you have conservatism. Conservatism consists of wealthy European landowners and nobles who want to preserve traditional monarchy. They are comfortable with monarchy. They think monarchy was effective. Monarchy often would work with the nobility and the landowners, and it meant that you're not going to have these revolutions that give power to everybody. So conservatives do not really want to progress. They want to stay with traditional monarchies. Whereas liberalism are European middle-class business leaders like the bourgeoisie, new merchants, even people from a poorer class, who want to give more political power to elected parliaments and to become more progressive, to move on from old traditions and create new governments. And we start to see at the Congress of Vienna these two different groups emerge. And it's really like how we have Republicans and Democrats. We start to see that happen within European leaders. So the first political philosophy is conservatism. Conservatism is all about bringing back traditional institutes. You see, practical experiences are more important to them than ideologies. They favor institutions or traditional institutions, and they believe that the individual is responsible for their personal success and failure. Conservatives, if you think of the root of the word, they want to conserve. They want to conserve their time period. They want the same things that have been before because it's comfortable for them. They believe that it's worked before. They think progression is maybe a little bit too much. And conservatives were kind of afraid of Enlightenment ideas. So here is the leading conservative of the time. It's kind of blurry. His name is Edmund Burke. He said a spirit of innovation innovation or progress is generally the result of a selfish temper and confined views. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. I'm going to flip to liberalism first because you guys typically know politics from our country with conservatives and liberals. So liberalism back in this time period during the Enlightenment was a little bit different than the liberalism we see in the United States, and it almost fits more with like a libertarian. So liberalism at this time was somebody who wanted Enlightenment ideas in their governments, and that's what you should write. I should have put that here. They wanted Enlightenment ideas in their government. They looked at all the natural rights that the Enlightenment thinkers were promoting, and they wanted those in constitutional governments. They did not want a monarchy. They wanted a constitutional government. They also promoted laissez-faire economics, and they wanted more voting rights for more people. And because with more voting rights for more people, you'd have a stronger political body and a constitution. Some liberals at this time were okay with doing a constitutional monarchy as long as people's natural rights were protected. So they were really focused on the rights to life, liberty, property, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and everything like that. Then you have utopian socialism, which is like the complete opposite of capitalism. Capitalism is meant to drive you personally, to make you successful. Whereas socialism is both an economic and political theory where you see that public interest, like everyone as a whole, should be more important than yourself, more important than your self-interests, and more important than your self-success. The state is responsible for personal success and failure. Society can be channeled in positive directions if everybody works together. So utopian socialism is all about the fact that both economically and politically, you don't really have roles like a doctor who makes more money than a teacher. Everybody does their job and they do it simply for the benefit of everybody else. They don't do it for money. They don't do it for competition. And then politically for socialism, you have a government, typically in socialist systems, but that government is meant to just make sure that everybody works together for the best welfare of the community. So that's what socialism really is. And as we continue with the course, we'll see how different groups take on these different political ideas and use them to create their own nation states. So you can look at this chart here. I didn't really focus on this. This is kind of how liberalism has changed. So classical liberalism from the Enlightenment just focused on individual liberties being more important than the government. Social liberalism looks at more social liberties, the freedoms that people should have, freedom of religion, freedom of marriage, and stuff like that. Progressivism is where you try to create reforms to help the government. And then libertarianism and conservatism, you guys can look here and kind of see what those are like. The next big ism is feminism, where we see in the Enlightenment and the revolutions all of these new documents written, like the Declaration of Independence in the Americas. In France, you have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. But in these, you just over and over again see the word man. And women started to say, look, the rights of women should be just as important as the rights of men. Women often hosted Enlightenment thinkers and heard a lot of these Enlightenment ideas in the salons, the coffee houses, but they weren't really taken seriously by the male population. There was an author, famous author named Mary Wollstonecraft, who was best friends with Voltaire. She often would have Voltaire publish her materials under his pen name. And then one day he was able to convince publishers to publish an article, a pamphlet that she wrote called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in this, she was very bold and blunt about the fact that women not only deserve these rights and protection under constitutions, but they will benefit society if they get them. So Mary Wollstonecraft wrote specifically that women deserved a right to education universally. Everywhere women should get the chance to be educated. And women should have an opportunity to serve in political positions or to have their own professions. And so she is like a leading trailblazer for the feminism movement. And we see that women are going to start getting these ideas because they've participated in the revolutions. Like, women marched on Versailles and demanded the monarchs to go to Paris. They were one of the main reasons the revolution happened. So why didn't they get those rights given to them in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen? When we have our coffee house discussion, we'll talk about how patriarchy was so ingrained in society that even Enlightenment thinkers didn't always include women in their thoughts. And so when looking at women and getting the right to vote, you're going to see this book here. This is her book about a vindication of the rights of women. And you can look it up online. You can see even more of what she said because it's just so interesting, everything that she had put out there, all of her thoughts. The next ism is abolitionism. And abolitionism is all about abolishing slavery. So if you take the root of the word, it's about abolishing slavery. And just like for women, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers and a lot of slaves themselves started thinking, if everyone else is getting these rights, slaves deserve these rights as well. A lot of Enlightenment thinkers believed that slaves should be freed. If you were to read the Declaration of Independence in the United States, Thomas Jefferson said that all men are created equal. And these ideas started to get spread around, and people were like, okay, you know what? I think slavery is something that we need to look at this point. And so we see this new fight for freedom. The slave trade is the first thing that's going to be abolished. Britain's going to be the first one to do it. They're no longer going to sell slaves and ship them from Africa across the ocean. Then it takes about 30 more years for slavery as an institution to be abolished. And the way that happens is slaves are set free in different colonies at different times. Slaves are not the only people working to get freedom for them. You see groups like Quakers and Protestants. Quakers came to the New World, like they were in Pennsylvania, very peaceful. Other Protestant religions. Industry is really going to drive the desire for freedom for slaves. And by that, I mean a lot of these industrial workers that we're talking about in the next unit are going to try to create machines specifically to help decrease slave labor. So now you have machines that can do something, you don't need slaves to do it. Between 1790 and 1890, slavery is going to lose its steam. People start to really look at it as a human rights issue. This should not be happening. The Enlightenment was very critical to slavery. The revolutions started having everybody, including the slaves, looking at things like liberty and equality. Quakers and other religious groups are going to find slavery repulsive. And then we see those industrial innovations that they're going to try to make slavery obsolete. Like, we don't need slaves to do this work anymore. Actions of slaves helped to end slavery too. I wish we had more time in this class to talk about it. There were so many slave revolts or attempted slave revolts that we had seen slaves fighting against the institution pretty much from the moment it started. The most successful revolution where an entire nation was created from a revolt was in Haiti. They revolted against the French. And once Haiti revolted, other Caribbean or West Indian islands are going to see this, and they're going to revolt and win their independence as well. Britain is going to be the first nation that ends slavery. One of the arguments is that they were ruled by a woman named Queen Victoria, who looked at those human rights issues a little bit more deeply, like feminism and abolition, and she's going to really push those. A student asked me why I thought it was Britain. And one of my theories is that Britain pretty much lost their only American colony during the Revolutionary War when the United States formed and broke away from England. And so that was really their only colony, other than a couple small little islands, that had slaves producing things for them. So by the time this time period rolls around, they didn't even really have an area where they ruled over that used slaves. So it was easier for them to start thinking, okay, you know what? We don't need this slave labor anymore. Let's try to bring it to an end internationally. They start to put pressure on everybody to end slavery. In 1807, Britain said that nobody should trade slaves anymore. They sent a navy out into the Atlantic to try to stop any slave ships. And then by 1834, Great Britain said, if you are a colony of ours, no matter where you are, all slaves in the British Empire will be freed. Sorry, there's a typo. So, coerced labor, the system of it, is really going to start to come to an end. Most Latin American countries, when they win their freedom in their independence movements, they abolish slavery. The Russian leader at the time, Alexander II, is going to emancipate serfs. So they're going to get rid of serfdom. Finally, they're like 300 years behind. And then in the United States, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is going to pass the Emancipation Proclamation that's going to end slavery in the United States. One of the last regions to end slavery was in 1888. Brazil is going to end their slave system. That was so heavily influential in the way that Brazil was founded. And so all of these countries, I'm so glad they abolished slavery. But a lot of these countries are going to start to go through a really hard transition where they try to figure out economically what to do with their nation. They're not producing sugar anymore without that slave work, without the slave labor. So we're going to look at how they have to almost like rebuild themselves as nations. Resistance also came from slave owners and slave traders in the colonies in West Africa. The Asante Kingdom, we looked at in one of the documents, they were trading slaves and they were upset that it was being abolished because economically it was tough for them. Haiti was the only nation to abolish slavery and grant full equality to formerly enslaved people. For former slaves in some nations, emancipation was tough. In the United States, in the South, when slaves were freed, they weren't really given an opportunity to go anywhere, so they typically would continue to work on plantations. And they would get paid a little bit. So it wasn't necessarily slavery, but it was basically slavery. Again, it was like feudalism because they just didn't know where else to go. And so you see reluctance of former slaves to continue work, but it happened a lot. Some of them didn't know what else to do. former slave trading kingdoms began to rely on slave labor. And so Europeans would use the need to end slavery in Africa to start taking that over. And we talk about that next unit. So I showed my fourth period, and I don't know if I showed my second period. We're going to look at this on our coffee shop day. When you look at this painting, a lot of people who saw it when it was put in the gallery at first, they saw like a boat at sea and maybe a sunset. And they noticed, hey, the ship might be riding into rough waters. What they then saw when they looked closer were human body parts and human hands and shackles. And this painting was called A Slave Ship Riding into a Storm. And when people started to look at this was actually made by a European, but then bought by somebody in Boston in the United States. When people looked at this, it became a huge symbol for the abolition of slavery, because this ship supposedly was to be shown riding into a hurricane. And if the ship sunk in the hurricane and had all the slaves on board, they would not be able to cash in their insurance policy. But if the ship got damaged or got sunk and there were no slaves on board, they would get a higher pay in their insurance. So supposedly, whenever a ship was going to ride into a storm, they didn't want the slaves to get sick on the ship because it was rocking back and forth. They didn't want them to get bruised and injured because they wouldn't sell for as much. So they would just typically throw them overboard as if they were spoiled property. And this painting is meant to show how horrifying that is. You can see these hands here reaching up for help. And so this is an example of art being used for almost like propaganda for abolition. Portugal is going to abolish slavery in 1761, the United States in 1865, Great Britain in 1833, and Brazil in 1888. One of the last isms is called Zionism. I'm going to go really quick for this. It's a response to widespread anti-Semitism, which is anti-Jewish thought. And Jewish people at this time see everybody else demanding rights and demanding nation states to form, promoting nationalistic ideas, and they had been scattered throughout history. So Zionism is this movement where we see Jewish people really desiring and wanting a Jewish state back in their Jewish homeland. So we're going to continue to see Zionism working through the next couple centuries. The land that they wanted was in the Levant, which was at the current time controlled by the Ottomans. And so we'll look at how that kind of plays out, the relationship between them. The last ism is a tough one. It's a long one. It's called nationalism, where you have, I really want to talk about this during our coffee house conversation, so I don't want to talk too much here. Nationalism is an idea of creating a nation with concrete boundaries with people that share a common culture with you, language, history, culture. And nationalism can either break up a nation or form a nation. So for Italy and Germany, you had a couple different pockets of people who were not united together as a nation. And those groups are going to work together to unite and create a united Italian and German nation. In other areas, like the Ottoman Empire, you see different groups of people, different pockets of people that belong to a nation. They belong to the Ottoman Empire, but they don't want to because they don't identify with the culture of the Ottoman Empire. People like Serbs, Croatians, they want to be their own nation. So they try as hard as they can to break out of their current nation to create their own. So we'll look more at this together, but a nation is a group of people who share a culture. The Atlantic revolutions really gave rise to the idea of nationalism. You have this shift away from local politics to more of a nationally based politics. And we have new nations like the United States. There's new nationalism excitement in France. And so we're going to look at these new nations being formed. Let's see, these are just a few examples. People like the Greeks, Serbians are all going to fight against Ottoman rule. The Czechs, Czechoslovakia, and Hungarians are going to want independence or autonomy from Austria, from the Austrian Empire, and they want their own nation. Polish people, Ukrainians, they want to get away from Russia. There were efforts in Ireland to get away from Great Britain, from England ruling over them. So you see here, this is like the perfect example. Nationalism can either break big nations apart and create smaller ones, or nationalism can pull different regions together and create a larger nation. So we see the unification of Italy. You don't need to know everything specifically. You just need to know that Italy was just a group of a bunch of different regions, almost like city-states. And it's not going to be until the middle of the 1800s where they become the Italy that we know. The only group that rejected the idea of an Italian nation-state were the Papal States, where the Pope lived. He didn't want to be a part of Italy. So in the agreement, they created the Vatican City, where he basically had his own nation, and then Italy was just around it. And then I'll go back here for Germany. This is what Germany looked like. There was like 39 different small kingdoms in Germany. Austria is actually going to try to take part of Germany. And then the other group that does that is Prussia. Prussia is really going to work to unite all of these different groups. And then Prussia unifies Germany and it becomes the Germany that we know today. So by the end of all of this, we see secure nation states. They all have this intense feeling of making their nation the best. And that's actually going to lead into World War I. So we're going to come back to nationalism when we talk about World War I. So that's it for this ISM PowerPoint. We'll talk about it on Friday. If you have more questions, let me know. And you can always email me or anything. Thank you for listening. I know it's a lot.